Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's podcast, Considering Selling Your Firm. Don't make $1 million mistake. We'll give it another 20 or 30 seconds, then we'll go ahead and get started with the discussion. All right. I think we're good to go here. Let's get things started. Thank you for joining us if you're with us for today's live broadcast of Considering Selling Your Firm in 2021. Don't make $1 million mistake. Those of you who are joining us for the live broadcast get two extra benefits. Number one, you get a half a credit. PSMJ is a certified AIA learning unit provider, so you will get 0.5 learning unit hours. Don't go spending them all in one place there. For attending the live broadcast, you'll get an email within 24 hours of the conclusion of today's broadcast with a link to the recording, as well as your certificate for the continuing education credit. You also, the second benefit you get for joining us for today's live broadcast is you get the chance to ask questions of Karl Wohler, who's our senior M&A consultant here at PSMJ, who's joining me for our discussion about mergers and acquisitions. So if you've got a question for Karl, particularly if you're familiar with the GoToWebinar platform that we're using today, just enter that in the question panel, and we'll get to as many as we can. If we don't get to your question in the time that we've got here today, we've only got a half hour and we've got a lot to cover. We'll follow up with you afterwards and answer your question. I'm sure a lot of you have a lot of questions. From what I hear from Karl, things are busy on the M&A side right now. So anyway, yeah, put your question there if you want to ask anything else. With that, let's get started. So for those of you who don't know with Karl, he's been with PSMJ for, I guess, maybe 4 or 5 years now, and has been an M&A consultant in a whole bunch of different transactions, large and small, architecture and engineering. And it's not only the experience that he has in AEC with PSMJ that I think really makes Karl unique. It's that just like a lot of our consultants at PSMJ, he's kind of one of us. He started out as a chemical engineer with Polaroid and gradually got into M&A there and built a career in mergers and acquisitions across a whole bunch of industries before joining PSMJ. So he's a deal maker through and through, and really, I think one of the things that's really unique about M&A, mergers and acquisitions, particularly in this space, I always spell out mergers and acquisitions, because sometimes I get people say, what does M&A stand for? I don't know this term you're using. Anyway, for mergers and acquisitions, is creativity. And it's not always black and white. It's not always a simple calculation of how to put a transaction together. You're dealing with people and emotion and subjectivity and foggy information that isn't always crystal clear. And that's one of the things we'll talk about, is you're often dealing with projections and things like that. So Karl's a real creative deal maker. And hopefully gives us a lot of good insight on that creativity today. So with that, I don't want to spend any more time doing the intro because we got to get to this. Karl, thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Greg. Appreciate it.
Yeah, looking forward to talking.
Yeah.
So Karl, the 800-pound gorilla, if you will, in the room here that everybody's asking about is, I don't know, how could you sum up what the impact has been of COVID on mergers and acquisitions? Has deal making completely stalled? Has it accelerated? What's the word on the street that you're seeing out there as a result of COVID?
Well, sure. Thanks, Greg. And I really appreciate your intro there, because I think you're right. You bring up a great point about mergers and acquisitions, because both the M&A process of ownership transition and valuation for external market valuation in M&A, it's both an art and a science. And there is certainly mechanics, finances, legal, and procedure parts to it, but there is a whole art piece to it as well that has to go into putting together the right deal with the both sides having alignment of goals and interests, and that is very important. So 2020 has been a tough year for a lot of people and a lot of businesses, of course, and it's been an interesting one on the M&A front. And in a nutshell, I would say that the M&A activity went into hibernation from probably the March through September time period. But in the last 3 months, the market has come back to life in a very significant way. And it is very hot and very active right now.
Are you seeing any particular markets that are really strong? Are you seeing any particular buyers that are pretty active? Could you put any box around that?
Yeah. So let me answer, I guess the question will come up for a lot of business owners, is 2021 the right time to sell? And what impact has COVID had on the M&A market and my ability to sell? So let me perhaps start with the 2021 question. Is it the right time for me to sell? And I would say the answer is yes, but it depends. I would say yes, because the market is very active right now with buyers aggressively pursuing acquisition. So the market is hot with buyers right now. The but, though, comes in and is related to COVID. And that but is, for you, it may depend on how your company fared in 2020 through COVID. If COVID was a non-event for you, you're in a great position to sell in 2021. We have some firms for sale now that had profit up 20% in 2020. It was like COVID never happened. Needless to say, those firms are in a great position to in 2021.
While we're on that topic, and I don't want to jump around too much, but I think this is also a question that I've heard quite a bit over the past several months in some of our senior executive briefings and other discussions with AEC executives. How has PPP money kind of impacted the process? Is it harder to kind of understand a seller's true operating performance? How is that money getting treated in a transaction? Can you talk a little bit about the PPP impact?
Yeah, so that comes into how to manage COVID. So let me talk about, I talked about the firms that are having great years. That's an easy answer. Let's talk about the firms that haven't been so fortunate, through no fault of their own. COVID has impacted them more. I guess the question on the impact of a sale, in 2021, I think the key question is, can I sell now? Should I sell now? Or should I wait for a post-COVID recovery period? And that depends on how large was the profit decline that you might have experienced in 2020, and what is your timeline to a post-COVID profit recovery? That would be the first question. The second question I would have for owners would be, are you willing to be flexible on deal structure? Because if you took a profit hit, some buyers will want to work that into the deal structure to manage their risk in the transaction. I don't want to steal the company, but there's a reality of less profit that impacts value. So how do you come up with a win-win that can protect the buyer but make for a fair transaction? So that question will come down to, are you willing to have some of the purchase price paid later based on a post-COVID profit recovery? All of this needs to be factored into, what's your ownership transition timeline goal? If you want to be transitioned out in 2 years or 3 years, it may be difficult to wait a year or two to go to market, because most sale transactions, require the sellers to stay involved full time for 2 or 3 years. So that's the dilemma that will impact your decisions. So perhaps I will get into let me go over the M&A market today in AEC to start, and then we'll circle back to this COVID and PPP impact, if I could, Greg.
Yeah, absolutely.
So right now, the M&A market for engineering, environmental, and construction services companies is very strong, with both strategics and private equity and family office buyers actively looking. Infrastructure is hot. Environmental is very hot. I'd also say geographically that southern states are the hottest, and as you can imagine, this is following the U.S. population growth demographics. But the market is good everywhere.
That stuff seems to be consistent with pre-COVID too, right? I mean, those were trends that we were starting to see even before COVID happened. Yeah.
The market for engineering, environmental, construction services in pre-COVID was very hot. It went on a 6-month hibernation period. It's come back in the last 3 months and is very hot right now. In fact, I might even say it's a little hotter than at the end of 2019. So it's actually a good time to sell from the presence of buyers in the market. There are more and more private equity and family offices firms entering this space looking for acquisitions. So that's becoming an option that is more and more available as time goes on.
Mm-hmm.
As you know, these private equity and family office recaps can provide an interesting hybrid solution where some shareholders want to sell and transition out, while others want to roll their equity and stay long term. So it can be a nice, kind of compromise solution with different shareholders having different interests.
You're seeing an uptick in interest in that?
Absolutely.
In the past 12 months or so?
So private equity and family offices have over $2 trillion of dry powder in their checking accounts with ready to write checks and buy companies. They have more money available than they have good deals, so they're expanding their area of opportunities looking for deals. They've typically stayed out of this AEC sector because of the human capital nature of the business. That can provide some concern to them. But there are plenty now that see this as a really interesting opportunity to partner with management, to keep management involved and let them to continue to run the firm and be successful down the road.
Hey, Karl, real quick, could you just kind of give a little bit deeper explanation, the difference between private equity and family office?
So private equity is typically investing other people's money, is the easiest way to put it. And in doing that, they would typically go out to large firms that have large amounts of cash to deploy for an invested return. And they will sign a contract to take some of that money on for 5 to 7 years and use that money to go buy firms, to aggregate firms through acquisitions and sell them for a profit later. Investors into private equity firms are typically, university endowments, pension plans such as CalPERS, United Auto Workers, insurance companies, and high net worth individuals. It's similar to a lot of people have heard of real estate investment trusts. That's a vehicle for people who want money invested in real estate, but they don't want to manage buildings and chase tenants for rent. They put the money into a fund where professionals in real estate go out and buy properties, improve them, sell them for profit, and participate in that profit gain. That's what private equity does in buying businesses. Now, family offices have emerged over the last 15 years as, kind of high net worth families, who want to invest long term, who have decided they have enough M&A experience to do it on their own. So the difference is they're investing their own money. The nice part about family offices is they typically take a 10 or 20 year view on investments, so they don't have the need to be in and out of an investment in 5 to 7 years. That long view is typically quite well received in the with sellers and rollover equity management members.
And what do you see more of that on the architecture side or engineering side, or where do you typically see the interest from those sort of entities?
Great question. More on engineering, environmental and construction services. There's been some hesitation on the architecture side, but we are seeing more and more of it coming and emerging on the architecture side. And by the way, earlier I said the market was hot for engineering, environmental, and construction services. Architecture is not quite as active as those. It's not as much of a seller's market. But again, it was not a seller's market late in 2019. So again, what we're seeing today is very similar to what we saw before COVID. But I would also say that there are more architecture buyers even now, I would say, than there were at the end of 2019. So it's actually gotten a little bit.
Sure. So let's get into valuation a little bit, because I think that's where you're seeing a lot of change or potential issues associated with COVID. One of the questions I'm hearing a lot is firms that maybe saw a little bit of an impact, diminishing backlog, maybe a little bit of a dip in revenue even in 2020 or even into 2021, but they expect it to be short term and they expect to see another side. So how how are buyers and business valuation consultants getting their arms around this uncertainty right now, and how do sellers make sure, like you said, that they're not getting into a situation with a buyer who's trying to kind of buy them with their own money, if you will.
Sure.
They're taking advantage of that, what might be a brief dip in revenue or profit or backlog.
Yeah, so let's talk about valuation and COVID. First, we need to visit the fundamentals of valuation. And valuation is all about achieved and delivered profit over the past few years as measured by adjusted EBITDA. It's used because it's the best proxy for free cash flow of the business. For those of you familiar with commercial real estate, it's the equivalent of net operating income in a real estate activity or business. So think about adjusted EBITDA as you would your GPA in college. It's the one number or score that distills all performance and accomplishment into a metric that can be used for valuation. So businesses are typically valued on a multiple of your delivered EBITDA over the last 3 years or trailing 12. So anyway, now we come into a COVID year. And by the way, if you want more information on adjusted EBITDA and valuation metrics and how to measure this in your firm, feel free to give us a call or send me an email. I can send a more detailed PowerPoint deck on valuation and the derivation of adjusted EBITDA. But anyway, what's happened in the last year has put stress on valuation. Well, a lot of firms have had a COVID hiccup. How do you manage that into your valuation? Well, part of the development of adjusted EBITDA typically allows for non-recurring events to be ignored or added back. So if you've had a 20% profit hiccup in 2020, what's the right value for the firm? Well, indeed, we closed an engineering firm in August where the selling firm was experiencing a 20% decline in adjusted EBITDA in 2020. The buyer closed the deal on the full valuation based on 2019 results. And that buyer's opinion was COVID impacted the seller, it impacted them, it is a non-recurring event, it will go away. We're in it for the long run, we will pay the 2019 price. But I will tell you
that seems like, and you tell me, Karl, but that seems like probably one of the biggest mistakes a seller could make right now is getting hung up on that, or letting a buyer, I guess, talk them into the idea that they should take a real penalty in valuation. Now look, there might be cases where, maybe the seller is in a market that is going to suffer some long-term injury. But I don't know, that sounds to me like where the potentially biggest issue is, right?
Yeah, so I mentioned that example as one case. We have other clients that are down 30% in EBITDA and have put the sale process on hold till the beginning of 2021 to wait for a better picture of what profitability will be next year. But there's a more middle ground that we're seeing, which is more common, and that's an adjusted deal structure to account for COVID risk. We're seeing deals where if there's a 20% decline in profit this year, the purchase price paid at closing will be reduced by 20%. And the transaction will include a contingent part of purchase price paid later, which is called an earnout. And that will be paid over 2 years as the acquired firm recovers the 20% of profit loss. So this so-called earnout structure is becoming much more common across all M&A in the last year. It can be a nice way to manage and share risk between buyer and seller about the achievement of a recovery. But the problem with an earnout, the challenge that needs to be worked around is if your goal is to acquire a firm and integrate them into your firm as one unit, you can't do that with an earnout. You need to leave it as a standalone division so that you can have 2 years of profit measurement. So that's the challenge.
Mm-hmm.
But we
Mm-hmm.
do see them, it's an effective tool to get a fair deal done now.
What about, are you seeing situations where revenue, and maybe you can talk about this a little bit, things like revenue and profit, I mean, you mentioned EBITDA, the earnings metric, fall right into how a valuation is determined, but there are some less specific things, or maybe less quantitative to some extent, things like backlog that don't kind of flow directly into evaluation, but certainly can influence evaluation. How are some of those softer things? Because remember, backlog hasn't turned into revenue or certainly not cash. Our buyers, if they see a dip in things like backlog, if they see that the company has had to make some staffing adjustments, they see that there may be carrying office space that they might not need in the future if there's kind of a work from anywhere model. How much is that kind of non-specifically kind of financial stuff playing into valuations right now?
Okay, you will see some, one of my first $1 million mistake point that I'd like to make is that all business owners should know and understand the market metrics for valuation. And the market method of adjusted EBITDA times a market-based price multiple, that rule has been set by the market, and that is the reality of the market. I didn't make the rule. I'm an advisor to facilitate fair deals and get deals closed. The market makes the rules. You will see some valuation methods that include factoring in headcount and backlog and other numerical items. That's going to give you a misleading result or expectation on valuation. That can be $1 million mistake.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you another example of $1 million mistake. We had a client that came in looking to be sold that was 25 million of revenue and 2 million of EBITDA. 2 years earlier, they were 20 million of revenue and 3 million of EBITDA. And they changed their corporate strategy to focus on revenue growth to get to 30 million. And in doing that, the marching orders were revenue at all costs. They started pricing jobs lower. They increased revenue by 5 million, decreased EBITDA by 1 million, and they made a $4 to $5 million valuation mistake because the firm was worth that much less. So that can be the challenge. Now, backlog is helpful because it will give comfort of the forward projection, but remember, value is based on delivered financial results in the last 12 months and 3 years as measured by adjusted EBITDA.
So what should sellers, Karl, what should sellers think or be doing or be considering if they're thinking about selling the firm in the next even 12 or even 24 months, PPP money? If they took PPP money, how is that going to impact their valuation? What should they know about that?
Sure. Selling a firm with a PPP loan in place is not an issue. If you received a loan and have not received forgiveness by the closing, the standard practice in the M&A arena has been to transfer the loan obligation to the buyer with an escrow set aside until the forgiveness decision is made. So if the loan is forgiven, the loan is canceled and the escrowed funds go to the seller. On the other hand, if for some reason the forgiveness request is denied, the escrow funds would then go to the buyer to pay off the loan. Because remember, a standard deal structure is cash-free, debt-free. So in a normal transaction, the seller gets to take all the cash home with them and exclude it from the transaction, but is required to pay off all debt at closing. So this PPP loan is managed as a special situation pending forgiveness. But again, there's no need for it to slow down. We have plenty of deals in process to be closed in the next few months that have PPP loan forgiveness applications in process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And what about, if you're a seller? What's interesting to me in some of the conversation you and I were having is there's also, just because things have changed with COVID and there are some unique as we said, kind of million-dollar mistakes with respect to PPP or with respect to valuation calculation. All the other million-dollar mistakes that existed before that, those still apply, right?
Sure.
So, I mean, if you don't have a leadership development plan, or you mentioned client concentration, I mean, what are some other things like that? But there's still, I would imagine you see these things day in and day out as transition issues before COVID, during COVID, and after COVID. Can you talk a little bit about some of those more evergreen mistakes that you're seeing out there?
Yeah. So let me go back, and again, the number one mistake, I think, is not understanding the metric for valuation. If you own a firm, you should be tracking adjusted EBITDA every year through the life cycle of the firm and your ownership, because that is the best yardstick for you to determine if you are growing and increasing the value of your firm over time. So that one is at the top of the list. But the second mistake can be customer concentration. If you have a client that represents over 20% of your revenue, you should work overtime to try to reduce this percentage. If you have a client that's over 30%, your largest client, you should make it a real priority to reduce this number. Buyers perceive client concentration as a cash flow stability risk and will walk from the deal or reduce their valuation to account for this risk. So you could have the best relationship imaginable with the top client, but things can change through no fault of your own, and buyers know this, and they'll factor that into a reduced valuation.
How far are buyers looking back on, we talk about valuation and the earnings multiples. Is how far back they're looking changing as a result of COVID? Is it possible? It seemed like the tradition or the conventional wisdom was sort of 3 years.
Yeah.
Are buyers want to look back 5 years now with some of the COVID uncertainty in 2020 and 2021?
What we see, interestingly, is we're typically, the look back is 3 years. If you provide 5, that's even better. What we also see some buyers asking for is, what was your performance through the Great Recession? Because you say, well, gee whiz, that was 10 years ago, but it talks about the firm's ability to weather a downturn, and it makes for an interesting conversation, which can be helpful as well.
Sure. Hey, the other thing too, we've talked a lot in our discussion here today about kind of downturns, and if you've experienced a dip and how to work around that. Hey, look, there are plenty of firms that are actually having really good years, or at least comparable to 2019. And I guess the inverse is true there. Don't let a buyer kind of undervalue that or fail to give it kind of the due consideration, because it's definitely not always just because you're in the right place at the right time. Look at our circle of excellence. Those firms come from all corners of the market. And I bet we will see, when we run that calculation in 2021, firms that maybe were in what you might consider kind of mediocre markets still hit it out of the park because they're just really well-run organizations. So are you seeing that too, that there are firms that are actually having a really good year in 2020?
We're seeing market rate valuations that are fair with no, hey, the world's in COVID. If we're sitting here in December on a year where you're 20% up in profit versus 2019, you've certainly proven your firm to be COVID resilient. So, there may be some buyers that might come in low because of COVID, but these companies are being sold at very fair valuations that were, I would say, similar to, or maybe, the valuation they would have received at the end of 2019 with the same profit scorecard.
Sure. So there's another, I guess it comes back to that consistent theme of don't, just because you might hear doom and gloom in kind of the mainstream media, don't let a buyer kind of undervalue your firm. Karl, just 2 more quick questions before we wrap up. What have your thoughts on ESOPs, employee stock ownership plans? Those are becoming, more and more common. Still probably quite in the minority as far as architecture and engineering firms go. You seeing any? Are those a good place to be right now, or a bad place to be right now with respect to selling a firm?
It can create some challenges with selling a firm, but it's very manageable. There are some private equity firms that have bought companies out of ESOPs and, liquidated the ESOP. We have seen some firms go through basically a recapitalization where, you can exit an ESOP. Well, first of all, you can sell a firm with an ESOP. It's very manageable to do it. It's very doable. So I wouldn't say there's any problem with that. If the ESOP is not working for you, another option is to bring in a private equity investor, even in a minority position, to take out the ESOP and leave you in control or in the day-to-day ownership and leadership of the business. One thing I will say is some firms that are 100% ESOP, they can be cumbersome in that you can't properly reward your key people with more equity because, by ERISA regulations, they have to be non-discriminatory. We do see the firms that seem to succeed and work the best with ESOPs are partial ESOPs, where there is another class of stock that can be used for key leadership. But again, ESOPs are selling. There's no obstacle to selling an ESOP firm. Another option to think about is use a private equity recap to take out the ESOP while staying in leadership control and maybe even in ownership control, because that's an option as well.
So, one last question that came in that I think is a really important one. We touched on it, but it's worth just drilling into just a little bit more. Is there more value to being resilient during COVID to a buyer? And I think the answers are resounding yes, right, Karl? I mean, that's the well-run firms are always going to be more valuable, even if whether it's market driven or internally driven. Those firms are always going to be more valuable. Is that right?
That's absolutely the case, because the company has passed the stress test and done so quite nicely. So, even if you're flat versus 2019, whereas your historical growth has been 10% a year, if you manage your business well and well for you is flat, that will be well respected by buyers. But, the long and short of it is if you're interested in ownership transition, you should always be thinking a few years out. Yeah. And to me, if you're not sure that the market will give you the structure and the value you're looking for, sometimes it can't hurt to go to the market and test it. It might set up a framework for you to better understand how to get to a successful transaction in a year or two.
That's a really good point that we've, in the half hour we've had together here, we've talked about $1 million mistakes more in the active sense, that you might actually leave money on the table in a transaction. There's also $1 million mistake in the passive sense, in that you do nothing. You try to wait, and even worse, try to time the market. Maybe that's the biggest $1 million mistake is putting off an external sale and putting your firm's future, your employees, your clients that much more in jeopardy. Because you maybe were a little spooked that maybe you had a little bit of a down year. And what I'm hearing from you, Karl, is don't let that spook you. I mean, that stuff can be worked around.
I mean, obviously, when you go to the market, the ideal is to work through the process and execute a sale. But at a firm in 2019, we were after the LOI, and the firm experienced about a 20% profit decline. This is pre-COVID. The firm from you. If you want to wait and fix that, we're happy to close after your fixed period.
Yeah. And the key in all of this, I think, is to find those buyers, right? Don't settle for the buyer who's looking for the fire sale, the buyer who's looking to, as we said earlier, buy you with your own money. The quality buyers are out there, and they will continue to be. Yeah.
So to finish the story, that seller. I hate to say it, he did some, he said, I kind of went into a little bit of semi-retirement mode, took my eye off the ball. I can go back and fix this. He said, I want to wait a year. He put his hard hat back on, went back to work. He recovered the 20%, brought profit up another 10%, and 12 months later, he closed with the same buyer. happily who paid a higher price than the initial offered price because of that recovery.
Yeah.
And it worked
Good.
out great. So that's, the question. Sometimes you can go to the market and find the right suitor. You can build a timeline that works for everyone as well.
Sure. All right, listen, if we didn't get to your question in the discussion, in the time that we had here today for our discussion, or you have more questions, happy to, for anybody who joined us for the live, this is actually a third benefit that you guys get for the live broadcast, complimentary one-on-one discussion with Karl or one of our other M&A consultants. I know sometimes, M&A always is a very confidential topic, and, asking questions in kind of a generic format like this isn't always easy, and sometimes there's it's more complex than a simple 5 or 6 word question. So if you do want to set up a consultation with Karl, the best way to do it is through Susan Lecomte, who runs our consulting and mergers and acquisition business. She can kind of coordinate with Karl's schedule, so she can reach that. This will be in the follow-up email as well, but S. Lecomte, SLECOMTE, S. Lecomte at psmj.com, SLECOMTE. And Sue would be happy to put you in touch with Karl, or if it's one of our other M&A consultants, go for there. Karl, thank you so much for joining us today. I think this was a great discussion. Lots of good advice packed into 30 minutes. If you missed anything, folks, keep an eye out for that link to the recording later today or tomorrow morning. Karl, thanks for your time. Really appreciate it. Everybody, thanks for joining us. Have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Take care.